welcome back to the next episode of StreamTime Sports. My name is Chris Stone. I'm the community lead at Sports Pro Media, joined as always by our CEO, Nick Meacham. Now, Nick, last week we spoke about video games. We talked about the return of NCAA football, and I just wanted to kind of update everybody on how my first Dynasty team went. My wife was in Italy for a wedding, so conveniently I had 72 hours uninterrupted, although I did manage to go out for a little bit of fresh air. But I did manage to take San Diego State from a 2-star team to a 4-star team, Nick. I've yet to sign a 5-star recruit, but I have started landing some 4-star recruits. And it was brought back a lot of good memories of being a younger person with less responsibilities. But, 2 thumbs up from me.
Nice. Well done. I mean, I'm curious on actually the game itself. I think Steve maybe covered what he thought it would be like, or maybe you did in the last pod, but is it more gameplay, like you're actually just playing American football matches, or is it more strategy, a bit like Football Manager, or is it a bit of both? Is it sort of a hybrid of the two?
So I guess it definitely depends on how you want to play. I personally have been doing Dynasty mode, which would be like kind of your career mode in FIFA. I'll be honest with you, I've spent more time recruiting than I actually have playing the actual game itself, trying to convince high schoolers to come to my university because we're based in San Diego and it's a lovely campus and you would really enjoy your time there, or the fact that I'm now a B+ star coach of my prestige. You should want to come to play for me, but don't talk about our NFL prospects because we've not had any players drafted yet. So, I've spent probably more time recruiting and on the strategy side of things than I actually have on actually playing. But I've been told I'm a sick individual because I only run the inside veer, which is triple option. For those that don't know American football, this is basically like if you made American football like rugby, it's the original football from like the 1910s and 20s. And all I do is run the triple option. So I've been told I'm a bit of a sick individual on how I do play the game, but I love it.
Well, look, Chris, hopefully you haven't lost everyone who's not an American football fan by the description and the run through all the options that you're playing there. But it sounds like you've had a lot of fun, and hopefully you'll be able to continue to see your team raise itself to 5-star status, even when the wife's back in town, because sometimes it might be a little bit more tricky to carve out those hours required. But good stuff. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it, and I hope people enjoyed the deep dive into the gaming side of things last time. But obviously we're going to take quite a different approach this week. But I've got a question for you before we jump into things. The Olympics are basically ready to kick off in Paris. What's your favorite sporting competition to watch at the Olympics, the Summer Games?
There's probably 2. One of them is just the basketball, because it's sort of like I just talked about Dynasty mode in video games, right? The only time you're ever going to get some of those players on a team where you create a super team is the Olympics. And I know the U.S. Olympic team is sometimes kind of faltered, but it is sort of the ultimate fantasy sport, seeing Steph Curry throwing alley-oops to LeBron James, who then whips a pass out to Kevin Durant, who then, throws the ball into the post to Joel Embiid, who's now in the USA team. So it's kind of fun because it's really the only time you'd see that in a competitive space, because like there is the All-Star game, but like it's like 300 to 298. No one's really playing. So it's just kind of fun to do that. And then the other one, like, it's not quite the same without Usain Bolt, but there is something just incredibly exciting about seeing how fast a human being can run. So I do enjoy the track and field events, particularly the sprinting. The running the 1,500 meters, like fine, but how fast can a human being run 100 meters is something that always has been exciting, despite Usain Bolt kind of falling off for a little bit. So those are probably my 2. The Winter Olympics, I love bobsledding, but obviously we're not talking Winter Olympics.
Bobsledding is great fun to watch. I mean, my general rule of thumb, I think, is pretty uniform, that with any Olympic event, if the Olympics is the pinnacle for that sport, then I'm much more into it. Then I find basketball, I do think the uniqueness of seeing the NBA stars in different settings, whether it be for Team USA or for other teams, like the Australian team, obviously one I follow, and to see some of these mid-level players, let's face it, they're not. Australia has created some great players relative to its size, but it's not in the same stratosphere as like the US team. But to see them compete against those and like fight hard and really grind their way through and actually and make it really a difficult competition is really cool to see. That's a patriotism kind of thing. I definitely think the athletics is always an interesting watch. I used to really get into swimming, and the main reason is because Australia was really good at it. So for many years, we were just dominant. It was either us or the Americans for for many, many years. And so we just watch it because Australia would win every other gold. Now it's, as sports democratizes, it's not quite as strong. I can't really pick one personally, but those, I mean, volleyball obviously is a good thing, is pretty cool to watch for the beach volleyball and indoor, but I also watch that in between Olympics, so it's not quite as exciting. Sports like handball, I don't normally watch them very often, but tuning into those is always good. But weird sports like modern pentathlon, I think, is a nice little curveball of a sport that I have watched. I actually watched it live at the London Games, and that was a really obscure concept. There's horse riding, there's shooting, there's a little bit of a cross-country run, but it's not a big run. I think there's swimming. Can't even remember the 5 disciplines. There's 4 of them I think I covered. It's a really weird sport, but I just love the obscurity of watching sports and getting into them and knowing that I'll never have to watch them for 4 years. And that's one of the challenges sports has, is trying to be always relevant and valuable to audiences. But the Olympics, I think, is just a great example of, you don't have to be relevant to people all year round if you can just find those tentpole moments and manage it. So looks like I'll be definitely tuning in to quite a bit of Olympic sports action over the next few weeks. I do wonder how it's going to go. I think the fact that it's now in a better time zone for the Americans, to see the amount of exposure this one gets, because the last 3 have been in Asia. I think it's interesting to see how that all plays out at the same time, and elections going on, to see if the coverage, because obviously the US media market is where the heart of the coverage comes from, how that's all going to manifest, and see how much, I guess, the Olympics just sort of grabs the airwaves, the social media airwaves, through the next few weeks. Could be interesting to follow.
Well, interestingly, Nick, talking about discoverability and the power of social media, one of the sporting events I didn't mention I wanted to watch will not be on the same time zone. Do you know which event that would be?
Oh, well, maybe. I'm going to say there's one obscure one that I'm aware of, which is the surfing being in Tahiti, in Teaupu, which I've actually
Thank you for
been
being able to
to.
pronounce it, because I couldn't pronounce it.
I've actually been there. I did a exchange program where I spent 6 weeks in Tahiti when I was doing French immersion at school, and so I spent a bit of time there. Went around the island and went to Teaupu. I think that's how you. I'm not even 100% sure. I went
Sounds
25
good.
years ago now. I went 25 years ago, and I stayed in a place called Faa, which is basically FAAA. That's a random fact for you. But yeah, I think that's one of the most obscure, must be literally the furthest Olympic event ever from the host city by some stretch.
Yeah, but it's technically French Polynesia, so that's how they've sort of made it work. But basically, I watched a TikTok, and TikTok, being great at what it does, basically explained why this is such a dangerous event, because they talked about how giant waves are created, and it has to do with how quickly the land sort of elevates, and they're like, basically it goes from super deep to super shallow, and they're like, they're some of the heaviest waves in the world, and they're like, if it weren't for the fact that these were Olympic athletes, the best of what they did, no one should ever go surfing there. So there you go, the power of TikTok and discoverability.
Yeah, so for those that are, I grew up on the Gold Coast in Australia, where surfing's quite a big thing, but there's a big difference between surfing at a beach with sand and surfing reefs, basically reef surfing. And the difference is that the waves manifest off the sand. It basically hits a sandbank, and that's what creates the wave. There, it's off the coral reef. But what happens is, if you're catching these waves, is if they're strong and powerful enough, is you could even see the coral like exposed at the bottom of the wave, if it's powerful enough sometimes. And Teaupu can be that. It's very famous in the surfing community. It's like one of the ultimate places to surf. But if you crash onto coral, my gosh, you will be worse for wear off of it. So there's extra incentive not to fall in those instances. It's not guaranteed to fall onto the coral, but you can, and it's really bad. So it's a very different style. It's much more, I think, if I remember correctly, it's more with coral breaks. It's much more consistent and more perfect in terms of its shape than you might get in sandy beaches. But anyway, it'll be one to watch, that is for sure. And hopefully not too many surfers can become worse for wear, because pulling coral bits out of your skin if you fall onto that stuff is not fun.
Well, there you go. There's our top events that we're looking forward to. But moving forward, going to the podcast, a little bit different format. Always trying to try new different things, and you see some of these different things. I watch. There's a podcast. It's the Overreaction Monday podcast by Rich Eisen, and he talks about have we overreacted to this week's news, sports, and kind of a similar thing. We spend quite a bit of time in the OTT and broadcast space talking about free to air, SVOD, AVOD, but today we're going to go kind of overrated, underrated, and we're going to talk specifically about the monetization models and whether we believe they are overrated or underrated. And it's a little bit subjective. It's going to be based on how we perceive that the industry talks about it. Because Nick, you and I talk to a lot of people. We host our own events. Our editorial team covers quite a bit. So it is going to be a bit subjective just on terms of what we think we hear from people and how that goes. And, there'll be a degree of market by market, things might change, but that's sort of the general route that we're going to go with it. So we've got sort of 6 or 7 different monetization models we're going to go through and hopefully maybe have a little bit of fun, a little bit of debate to go through it. But the first one to start with, Nick, is free to air linear TV. So when we're talking about our free to air linear TV, talking about traditional NFL on Fox or CBS, or potentially we just looked at the Euros that just took place over here, being on the BBC or ITV, your traditional free TV. Now, Nick, for me, I'm going to go and I'm going to say it is overrated. Now, the reason I'm going to say it's overrated is because we always look at the NFL is the sort of the reason why you should do free to air, because there's all this big money in advertisement, and the NFL is the most valuable sports league in the world. So everybody thinks free to air is great because look at the NFL and how great they are. I would flip it around and make the argument. I think part of the reason the NFL is great is because of the structure of the sport, the idea of the Premier League or even the NBA struggling with it. You can't always put adverts in where there's not breaks in the game. It works for baseball really well. It works for the NFL really well. But I think to use the NFL as your champion for free to air is really tough. I just don't think it's a replicable model that other people can necessarily do. And that's why I think it's overrated is we all look at the NFL. But I think the other reason the NFL has done well is its fragmentation, Nick, because it's been able to drive competition because it's got a streaming exclusive deal with Amazon. It's now added Netflix to the portfolio. It's got YouTube TV. It's got its own NFL Plus. Like, yes, it makes a lot of money from advertisement, but I think the fact that it's been able to create so many competitors and splice its rights up into so many ways, that's actually as much the secret sauce as it is the free to air. So there's my argument, Nick, for why free to air is overrated.
For those that listen to the podcast, you probably might have picked up that I would say that this is underrated still. I think that over the last 10, 15 years, maybe even 20 years, as pay TVs emerged as a viable competition to not only the attention economy of people, getting people's time, but also from a media rights perspective. Free to air has lost more and more content, but what we more and more live sports. But what hasn't changed is free to air TV in pretty much every major market has largely kept stable in terms of its consumption, despite the growth of streaming, despite the growth of social media, despite the growth of gaming and alike. Free to air's reach is still unrivaled in terms of legitimate watch time of people consuming content on the screen. But the problem has been for sports, looking through the live sports lens, is the monetization has become more tricky because there's so much competition now from pay TV that they couldn't hold on to those live rights they used to have. Sports like cricket in the UK and in markets like Australia were built, the foundations of its fandom were built off the fact that it was on all the major channels, and it became, in Australia, it became the national sport because in the summer months, it was the only thing you would basically watch because the major networks had it on TV, and that was it. You were void of other choices. Now, with more choice, free-to-air's power has become weakened as a result. However, it still brings the most audiences together in a concentration that you can anywhere in the world. Now, where the value is created from free-to-air is still a work in progress for sports. Most good commercial executives in sports understand that you need the scale of audience to be able to drive value out of sponsorship partnerships. So you can't just put all your eggs in the pay TV basket. Otherwise, your commercial partners will not get on board because they need the mass reach. And typically, major sponsors always want that mass exposure to create inertia around the perception of their brand, because that's, let's face it, that's the primary and secondary reason brand sponsor. Free to air is still best placed to deliver that inertia versus any other medium we have in sports media landscape today. So I think it's now become underrated in terms of strategy, because you will struggle to drive direct revenue from media rights through free to air. But the knock-on effects, as we're seeing e-commerce and digital sponsorships become more prevalent, its role is almost become a major player again, because of its ability to still deliver audiences at scale to a live audience, and you're not fighting for attention on the platform like you would on social media and alike.
Now, one thing I would say where I think free to air is underrated is I do think you're going to get to a point it's going to start to impact fandom. I've never quite bought the argument that Gen Z and younger people won't watch longer content, because I've seen them spend 3 hours on TikTok. My concern is, are they not watching it because they're not interested, or are they not watching it because it's not accessible? And at some point, if there's not enough exposure on free to air, do you eventually lose out on fandom, where it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy to say, oh, young people don't care about sports, but you've not put sports in a place that they can actually access them. So you can't drive an SVOD business or pay TV if you're not getting them in at a younger age. And for that instance, I actually do think free to air is underrated, because I think if you allowed people to watch sports, they would. I just think some of those stats sometimes are a little out of context.
Yeah, that's definitely fair. I'm looking at it through the sporting lens of the sports property itself, and I would say that the other part that add to this mix is that the generation of advertising revenue. We've been covering more and more. I want to continue to cover it more and more. I really do believe that advertising's role in sports will continue to grow. Free to air TV has been doing that game for a long, long time. They're a pretty fixed part of most advertising budgets of most major brands and media agencies currently. In the US, you are seeing a much bigger shift towards streaming, because the numbers show that consumption of free-to-air linear versus streaming, it is really shifting to streaming pretty quickly. Whereas in UK and Europe and other markets, it's much, much, much slower. So the money stays where the audiences are, and they're comfortable knowing what sort of returns they're going to get. So I think advertising, as it continues to become more targeted, will play an ongoing and more significant role in driving more value from those audiences than ever. As we've talked about in the last few pods, or several pods over the last couple of months, that brands are actively looking for new opportunities to have an emotional impact, I think, with consumers, and move away from what we saw the last 10 to 20 years of people just spending loads of money with big tech companies to reach eyeballs through programmatic advertising. They are looking for something different, some X factor, and that's what sports can give. Now, a lot of that money is going to progressively shift probably more streaming and streaming products, but that means there are linear products on streaming. But let's talk about free-to-air linear at the moment. I just still think it plays a huge role in driving that fandom. It basically makes sure that your sport is discoverable to those non-top tier fans. And, the casual sports and entertainment consumer, like I used to be an absolutely massive fan of cricket as a kid. As cricket was not made as available and was on pay TV, I'm not a decision maker on where my family spends its money. And to get people onto cable and those things is quite difficult. It's quite a commitment, right? So what happens actually over time, as you get less exposed, you just find other things to keep you entertained. So it's all great to recoup money for your rights through those investments, but longer term, your sport will take a hit from a fan perspective, for those tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 sports fans who are just casual, who just want something good to watch. And these days, good in the background, with the power of smartphones today and social media, sports in these instances is quite often just in the background when people are communicating or doing stuff on their phone. So that's the role that free-to-air linear plays, and that is okay as long as we acknowledge that. And I think it will continue to play a good role to reach scaled audiences for sports and to potentially attract new fans in the same way you can get that through other means. But I think free-to-air is still underrated, or has become underrated, and is still underrated. And I think if we can find a way to unlock that again, and unlock the monetization around that reach that it brings, then more sports properties will grow quicker and will win longer term. But it's a longer term commitment, and most C-levels in sports are not judged on long term success. They're judged on immediate wins, which is very, very difficult and counterproductive for this type of dynamic we're talking about.
So let's flip it from free to air linear TV to pay linear TV. So now we're talking, your ESPN, your Fox Sports that you get through, your Direct TV subscription or whatever. There's so many subscription services since I've left America, Nick. I don't even know who the big popular ones are anymore these days, Spectrum and the alike. Or if you're in the UK, you're paying for your Sky Sports, your Sky package or your BT package. It's typically linked in with your broadcast or your broadband provider. If you've got Sky Internet, you probably have Sky TV or vice versa with BT and TNT Sports. I'll let you kick this one off, Nick. Are we feeling pay linear TV is overrated or underrated these days?
Oh, much trickier one to answer. I'm yo-yoing between the both here. I'll go with the overrated for the moment because of the same reasons I talked about before with free-to-air, in that if your objective is to get big reach, then I'd be doing a deal with a linear free-to-air broadcaster over pay TV, and you're going to try and monetize it elsewhere. If you're looking to drive direct media rights revenue, then trying to sell your rights to a pay TV provider is a naturally more lucrative way than trying to give it to free-to-air. You just sacrifice some audience scale. What can be underrated from a pay TV provider is typically they're really good at building out. If they're really backing your sport, they're really good at building out all the shoulder content to help tell the story and get the most value out of those rights. So the examples you gave around, Sky and ESPN that in the UK and US that we follow closely, they are very good at ensuring people are up to date and following the stories of their respective investments. That doesn't happen nearly the same way in a linear free-to-air environment, or indeed across the traditional big tech streaming platforms who just largely run VOD content otherwise. So that bit, they are the best at the business of doing that, extracting the most value and building most awareness and excitement around that sport. And that bit is valued by some, but like we've had on the pod a couple of months ago when I did one of the sessions in New York, talked to the president of marketing, Robert Gottlieb. He pointed out that, I asked him about whether they brought into the conversation around rights agreements as an example. Now, he's not pay TV, but the point still applies, is that normally the marketing people are brought in after a deal's basically agreed with regards to the value of those rights, and then they work out how to get most value out of it. And I just think that the more the focus is on that part of it, the more you can maximize that reach and return on storytelling that pay TV players can provide. You can maximize it more through your other channels if they're really good at doing it and there's a really robust approach in place.
Yeah, and that's the example we've talked about with Formula One in the US, is that supposedly they left money on the table with Amazon to go to ESPN, and it's largely considered the reason they did that was everything else that comes with ESPN was worth the reportedly $25 million that they left on the table for the additional marketing, the additional content that ESPN would produce on its channels. And I definitely think that is absolutely one of the reasons why pay linear TV is still underrated, because I think one of the things as well is like it's less work for you to have to do. Now I know free to air does similar things, but we just mentioned there's only so much programming time that they have available on a linear 24-hour schedule, whereas a Sky Sports can create a Sky F1 channel, a Sky Premier League channel. It's not as easy, or I've at least not seen any examples of that on a free-to-air spectrum, that I think that definitely is something that you take into account, that there is value to it that might not come across in a monetary exchange.
Where it's going to get really interesting is as these pay TV providers start offering more linear solutions through streaming, is the space available? Let's say there's a term for it. I'm losing off the top of my head. The space for the programming, the gaps available to fill on those linear channels becomes really interesting to see how they do it. So, for example, with Sky, one of the things they're making available is through their new Sky Plus product is that they can have loads and loads of live sports running at the same time. And that's what streaming enables, is loads of content available rather than a really defined linear offering alone. So that just dynamic's going to be interesting to see if linear, as we're going to probably talk about later about like fast and so forth as well, but as that shifts to becoming more streaming centric consumption, the use of smart TVs more and more and more, will that make pay TV that has a scaled reach through streaming more powerful than, say, running that offering through for a free-to-air linear product on streaming, like a BBC ITV in the UK. I think it's really interesting just to see how that all plays out. Both, I think, can be really more and more effective as people spend more time consuming on those platforms. But will that means you have to go into an app, you have to actively seek to watch those standalone linear free-to-air say apps available to you. So it gets really, because they don't have the comprehensive catalog of content that you do, just finding it through your traditional linear approach that you do today. So I'm interested to see how that evolves, but right now I think there's a mix of underrated and overrated there, that's for sure.
So moving forward to the next one, we'll go with SVOD, subscription video on demand. So this could be something like your DAZNs. Obviously, they're global business. Depending on which country you're in, you're going to get different rights. For me in the UK, I'm subscribing to get NFL Game Pass, but also it could be something like UFC Fight Pass in the stateside, or ESPN Plus with their subscriptions. So Nick, I'm going to say it's underrated, but I'm going to put a caveat next to it. It's underrated for tier 2s and tier 3 sports. And the reason I would do this is it's actually something, one of the first things I ever had kind of a light bulb moment. You may not remember, Nick. We hosted our first executive forum in Madrid about 4.5 years ago. And one of the executives there was from the International Triathletes Union. And she told us they'd had a streaming platform for about 12 years. And we're like, that's an random bit of news I didn't know. And I remember you questioning her, being like, well, what do you charge? And something ridiculous, like $5 a month or something. And the argument
was $199. I'm pretty sure it was $199 if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I just remember it was a ridiculously low number. And you made the argument, if it's basic supply and demand, right? If there's nowhere else that people can get this content, you could be charging more. And, for example, I use NFL Game Pass. I'm a hardcore fan. I think I pay about 180 pounds for the product. I'd probably pay close to 300 for it because I want every single game. I think, particularly for tier 2s and tier 3s, there's an argument to be said. If you've done your other bits, got your ecosystem in place, and you've got the data, and you have the fandom, you're not going to get money from a pay linear TV. You're not going to probably get money from a free-to-air, although we've argued free-to-air could be the place for them. I just think there's an opportunity to make more money through subscriptions because how dedicated the fans that you have and the lack of options they have elsewhere. For tier 2s and tier 3s, I think SVOD could be an underrated approach to monetizing your content.
So with the triathlon example, one of the things that I also said was that triathlon is typically seen as a higher affluency than, say, football fans, right? So you're targeting an audience, a demographic that is typically better off charging them cheaper than any other subscription product that I've ever heard of. And one of the things I think they were struggling with at the time was monetization and still scaling audiences. So you've gone with a low price point, you're still struggling to scale audience because it's a niche service and you're not charging enough to make it worthwhile to market the product. How are you ever going to get anywhere with it? That whole back to people building a product they think is just going to magically be successful without investing huge amounts into marketing. And marketing can be through the investment into live rights, but it can also just be you still have to spread the word and get people to know about your product. And if you're charging at $199 for a premium offering, you're never going to get there. You're never going to get people to come to it unless you put a lot of investment, energy, and time into marketing, whether that be ad buys or social content, etc. So I think it's always flawed if you're trying to create a premium product. I don't know what they offer these days. I should actually have a look at it and see if they took our advice and changed their approach. But to your point about it being underrated, well, I'd say as an industry, it's been overrated for quite a long time, with the expectation that if you have a subscription service and you have all these fans, they're just going to go up and buy it because they love your sport. But we've seen countless times now, we've got no examples. We've got no examples of a sport growing by taking that approach. So what we've ultimately learned around subscriptions is it is a really valuable piece of a wider strategy. You need to have a special product to offer to subscribers for a premium set of audiences. That's a top tier of fandom, but it's only a couple of % of what you classify as a fan of your sport. It's a really niche part, but you can charge a load to it. Like your NFL example is a great one, right? So subscription is great if you balance that with a really comprehensive social media strategy and content creation, YouTube strategy, and have those linear partners, whether they are pay or free to wear, that give you the breadth you need to keep building the audience and fandom in there. And hopefully you've got a sport that is really great as a highlight product to keep building it through social channels. Subscription is a really powerful way of driving a load of value out of that top tier of audience for whether you're a sports property or whether you're a streaming service. So it has to be there, but every streaming product I can think of is now basically adding some sort of either hybrid tier or free tier made available. And so if they're doing it, it basically just, I think it validates that you can't just go all in with that approach. So yeah, I think it's now definitively been overrated over the last few years. Is it underrated to some of the people who are now gone like full 180 on this and going like we have to build a subscription product and all our energy is going into that? Now we're trying to make it all free and monetize other ways, or handing over our rights back to third-party providers. I think you need to be bullish on how you can either carve out your own rights to build a subscription product yourself, or work with someone who has a subscription product that sees value in your premium end of your rights offering. Without that, I think it's always going to be difficult to make it work for you.
So I'm going to go a little off piste here because I made a comment that I thought the NFL's success was largely due to its fragmentation, the way it's able to spread out all of its rights. And then you made a comment there that subscription should only be a part of the overall pie. Now, we're going to go basically talk through, like I said, 6 or 7 of these different ones. Is there any one that you think as a single monetization model would be the appropriate choice for someone to go? Or do you think the ultimate choice is always going to be a combination of some sort of these? Do you think any of them is capable of ticking all the boxes necessary?
Good question. I think in terms of general monetization, I think if you are able to do really good, expansive free-to-air linear deals that work, that give you the reach. So your sport's successful in getting mass reach because you're partnering with a free-to-air linear channel, and the rights are such that you don't have to have a pay bit, but you're able to monetize it through non-direct media ways, i.e. through sponsorships-related sales and advertising-related sales so not giving your rights to, say, a non-advertising led broadcaster, but selling them to a private advertising free-to-air product, let's say like ITV in the UK, and you're able to get reach with a little bit of income coming through from an advertising-led business, and then have the flexibility to really do some creative commercial deals are off the back of that, versus what you would normally get with pay TV is you'd be really restricted. You sell the tools or the toolkit typically, unless you've got a lot of negotiating power. I would say that's probably my preferred approach. But then you've got to back it up with a really robust commercial strategy with great storytelling, great USPs, and all those things to be able to monetize it in a more, say, a little bit more old school approach of selling sponsorship sales and doing ad deals with brands and agencies. The holy grail of the pay TV approach is if you're a sport property, you just hand over the keys, you get someone who pays you a lot of money, and they monetize it themselves, and that's job done. I think if you're willing to do the work on the commercial front, I think longer term you'll get a lot more benefit. And you, with those free-to-air deals, you have enough rights available to you to do what you like on social media to build really good audiences there, and not like what we have with the Olympics, where you're so restricted on the non-live content, you can't even do much through your own channels there as well. It's all handed over to the broadcasters because of those deals. Then I'd go free-to-air linear.
Fair. Well, we'll go back to our list now. We've gone from SVOD and we're going to go to another.
I would just
VOD.
say though, Chris, I could easily be swayed. Someone could easily talk push me the other direction there, but you forced my hand.
Yeah, I mean, I know I said free to air was overrated earlier. That was for the conversation. I agree, but again, I think it's also difficult, right? Because it's real estate as far as I'm concerned. There's only so many free to air channels that, while it might be the ideal spot to do all the things you talked about, there's just simply only so much real estate available on a linear program when there's 24 hours a day and only a small number of channels. So I agree, it's probably the ideal one, but that's also probably why that money's been tied up in the NFL or premium rights, because if you only get so much space, you want to make sure you're getting the best bits of it. So that's the tough part of it, right, Nick? Is like, it's the ideal one, but like, is it realistic for not tier one sports? I don't know.
Yeah.
So we're going on to another one, Nick. I imagine I'm going to just put words in your mouth. You're going to say this one is underrated, so maybe you can flip. But we're going to talk about AVOD. Obviously, you've spent a lot of time talking about advertising and where you think it's headed. Now, obviously, AVOD is a very specific form of advertising. It's not, the same ones that we're talking about, free to air. But overrated or underrated, Nick, when it comes to AVOD as a business monetization model for sports?
Well, let's just be clear that obviously AVOD stands for advertising video on demand. Now, we're talking about probably more ad-funded streaming services that are non-linear, like a fast, right? That's to be clear, the delineation.
Correct. Yes.
Because I just want to make sure that that's clear for everyone listening in, that we do kind of know what we're talking about, but we don't want to interchange terms too much where they can get a bit complex. My general view is, I think it's underrated. So the best example I can think of right now is one we've covered is FIFA is one of the first major players to launch a ad-funded streaming platform from a single sports property perspective. And I would expect to see more and more, which we are, streaming services to move more of an ad-funded approach for their advertising, for their streaming products, because the technology is getting better, the personalization is getting better, they can charge more premiums, and advertising agencies and brands are now finally shifting budgets across, because we're seeing it start in the US, because the inertia is there around streaming consumption. And if it starts happening in the US, it will start happening more and more internationally. So overall, I think it is underrated as a monetization approach for sports who are launching their own platforms. But I understand why it's underrated. It's underrated because it has not been achievable to monetize that at scale in the way you would want. And if you launch it yourself, the marketing of that, you still need to get mass eyeballs on an advertising product to the scale which you can monetize through advertising. So for streaming players, for streaming platforms, they've all made the move to advertising for a reason. I think I saw the numbers on Netflix's latest earnings call was something like 48% of new signups are ad funded subscriptions. So they're not going all in on the subs. There's still advertising being served in the Netflix offering. And I think that's another symptom, an example of the growth of advertising and its power and its value, both in the eyes of the tech platform, where we saw, I can't remember which platform was, in the hybrid model, if you had ad plus subs, your revenue, the average revenue per user was actually higher than the subscription, the ad-free model, because the premiums are such that they can drive more value on average out of those relationships. So I just think that it's going to continue to grow. I don't think you should have been all in on advertising yet, but I think quickly in the next 12 months to 2 years, you're going to see more and more significant revenue generation coming out of advertising, particularly through streaming channels. I'm excited to see. And sports is so built for that, because of what we talked about, how sport was so successful using linear free-to-air as a way of reaching fans and audiences that aren't those top-tier passionate fans. And I think that's what you're going to start to see, a little bit of that stardust come into advertising fund and businesses, because the barriers to entry will just be mitigated and reduced.
Well, it'll be interesting because you mentioned FIFA, which is obviously an owned and operated platform, but then you have YouTube, which, be a third-party platform. I mean, you've said it before, like the statistics are out. Like there's no platform that has more consumption than YouTube does. And, just simply following consumer trends. And I'm not saying everyone all of a sudden is going to have a YouTube streaming, product, but people are clearly okay with the idea of advertisements. That's one of the things I've always found interesting is people talk, the positives of subscription is there's no advertisements. And it's like, I think people are pretty much accepting of the fact that advertisements are just a part of, the consumption experience. I don't think some of those arguments about, oh, people will pay to get rid of it. Like, I've had YouTube for the last 10 years serve me an ad saying if I pay $5.99 a month, I don't have to watch ads. I still just watch the ads. So I think some of the things you've heard about that are supposed to be negatives about AVOD, I just think there's enough consumer behavior to show that, like, some of the positives of supposedly not going through an advertisement model, people don't care about watching commercials. They will watch commercials if it means that they got to watch their content for quote unquote for free.
Completely. 100% that's the case. I think YouTube, if you look back on their approach over the years, I remember talking to some people at YouTube at the time, they took a really smart approach, right? They basically build you up to consume more ads. So if you're really quick, and typically a lot of their ads early on in the day were like 5-second ads, 10-second ads, and then they occasionally will drop you in a 30-second. And they're basically based on your behavior, they will serve you more or less ads depending on what you do. So if you were to start dropping off from the service because you leave during an advert, then next time you go on, you're less likely to be served as many ads. So make sure you always skip that ad as quick as humanly possible. Otherwise, you're going to get served way longer ads and more ads more regularly is the tip that I learned and heard. So a bit of piece of advice there. But yeah, look, they've shown that people will have a tolerance to ads, and as long as they're the right size and in terms of length, then I think they'll continue to work really successfully. Typically, what we've seen the others do wrong is they've gone straight into the longer form ads, 30-second plus, and people just can't sit through all that in that immediate sort of environment. They'll just go into the next piece of content they can watch that doesn't have it on another platform. So YouTube have been really smart at building up people's tolerance and acceptance and comfort levels with ads, and it's been a success for them, clearly.
So I'm going to say two things. One serious, one just kind of not. I now, according to you, know why I get served the 60-second long ads is because we leave on YouTube just playing videos as background noise for my dog. So if we're out for 4 hours, none of those ads are getting skipped. So maybe Murphy just doesn't get any more background noise, or we find some other background noise for him that isn't YouTube. But on a serious note,
you train? I remember you trained him to like press buttons, to say he wants a drink and stuff. Well, you need to train him to skip the ads on YouTube, get another button installed.
You know what? If I can get my wife Heather to teach him to do that, that would be incredible. So those that don't know, my dog speaks with a keyboard. He's got buttons. It says eat, outside, play. Now 95% of the time it is eat and play, but technically he's got a full keyboard of words. But maybe that's what I'll do, Nick. We'll see if we can get him to understand it's an ad and skip it, so I can stop getting served 60-second unskippable ads. But on the real talk, no, Nick, from that point is, I actually despise the ESPN website, because if you ever want to watch any video content on ESPN, you're at minimum getting a 30-second non-skippable ad. And it's just like, that's why I go to YouTube, because I can't skip the ads. And I know I just made the joke there, but for the most part, I can skip most of the ads. Like, I watch almost no video content on ESPN, either on their app or on their website. If it's a news story, I'll read it, but I watch almost no video content for that exact reason. Like, it's minimum 30 to 60 seconds unskippable. I'm like, I don't care.
Yeah, and that's where the ad games becomes really interesting. So because a lot of the major ad buys are still done directly with streaming platforms and broadcasters, you still have an ad sales team selling ads. It's not just going through programmatic in a lot of these instances. They make more money out of longer ads and people going onto those ads. And where it gets tricky is that what stats aren't given and are given and made available to some of those partners, and you just watching it for a second or 2 seconds and then going away, depending on who they're talking to, might be enough for them to say, well, look, we've got all these this amazing viewership, even though people are jumping off those ads quickly, versus what we've talked about with YouTube being a good ad experience in comparison. So I think that is really one of the areas that the lack of visibility, I guess, in ad numbers and how consumption is actually happening on those platforms is what people like to keep close to their chest when they're selling ads, particularly if they're doing what ESPN's done. And I completely agree with you. I can't remember how many times I've been served an ad when I've gone to read some content. I'm like, I'm just out. I'm out so quickly.
Yeah. Every time. So what I'm interested in, Nick, because, AVOD, I kind of knew which direction you were going to go. I want to know where you stand on pay-per-view.
Oh, okay. Pay-per-view. Good question. I'm trying to wait. Well, I have a view on pay-per-view, but whether it's overrated or underrated is a good question. I think it is overrated for any sport to be considering bringing it in today. I think it is underrated through the eyes of a consumer. So this whole notion of like microtransactions, paying for just content you actually want to watch. We're still not in a place where consumers are doing that. They would rather just move off and go to an ad-funded a platform like YouTube instead of paying a couple of pounds, perhaps a couple of dollars for access to some premium live content. And they would rather go find it through pirated means if need be. And it is overrated for any other sport other than the fight sport to have that legacy that they've built up to tap into it yet. We've not seen any examples yet that sports are able to prove that they can drive real value out of that. So that's my take in a nutshell.
I'll be honest. I think it's one of the ones I am the most muddled on because I think it's underrated in the sense of I basically use Now TV. Those that aren't familiar with Now TV, it's a way to get. It's technically an SVOD model subsidiary of Sky, where if you didn't want to pay for Sky broadband, you could still get access to Sky Sports through Now TV. You can pay a monthly subscription, a yearly subscription. I would just buy a day pass. So as far as I'm concerned, like that's basically the equivalent of like pay-per-view. And the reason I think it's underrated is it is a very low commitment bar to watching something. And if you don't want to pay a monthly subscription because you've already got 7 services, pay-per-view can provide you that way of having a very low commitment to get into it. I think it's just overrated in the sense of it works really great when, Conor McGregor and Khabib Nurmagomedov, I can't pronounce his name, had a big fight, but it doesn't work well for lower tier games where the sense of you need to draw people in to do that. And, if I buy NFL League Pass, I'm buying it one time, but imagine being the promoter and you have to make that sales pitch multiple times a year. Like, I think it's just a lot of effort to get to where you want to be, and it only works for certain events. So as a consumer, I think it's underrated, but I could see where it's really difficult to pull off on a consistent scale as the one that's actually providing it.
I think that's a very accurate sort of synopsis on the issue and the opportunity that it does present itself. I've been in situations myself where I didn't have a pay TV subscription. It was exclusive. The Masters were exclusive. I just wanted to watch the Masters. And for me to sign up, it was going to cost an extortionate amount of money to sign up. It would have been cheaper for me to sign up for a month than just, hey, give me access for a day. I just want to watch the final round. Just give me access. And they just make it tricky and clunky. So if they can reduce that and just give me easy access, the microtransaction and buy access because I want to watch it. Same with the finals for, sort of trying to force me to become a subscriber. The problem is this whole love for lifetime value, getting a subscriber on the books is just worth so much from a long-term perspective that broadcasters have historically been built on and valued on subscriptions of subscribers alone. But I think you break down that barrier, I'm more likely to subscribe the longer term if I get good experiences every time I come to your platform. And that's definitely not there at the moment. So pay-per-view would love to see that being made more available, or pay-per. There's sort of another term that's not really used very often because it's kind of linked with pay-per-view, which is like TVOD, which is transactional video on demand. Same sort of thing, basically, because it's not necessarily live. Pay-per-view is normally associated with live, but just having, watching one piece of content, I pay a fee because I really want to watch it. I think that still should be made available to some people in some instances, but it's definitely not done these days.
It's definitely, like I said, I think one of the trickier ones because I can argue it both ways and depending on who I am. But I think I'd just personally like to see it a little bit more, but I can understand why Sky Sports wouldn't want to make more games available via pay-per-view than what they're already selling. I can understand why the people that have paid lots and lots of money to acquire those rights would not want pay-per-view to be bigger than it is. It's really purely me as a consumer being like, I would love to just have this as a one-off.
Well, just quickly on that subject before we move on, is that UFC's deal with ESPN was as such where a lot of their fights would just be made available through ESPN instead of being through some sort of pay-per-view offering. And I thought that was quite a big moving point. And that's one of the reasons you started to see UFC mirror a little bit more of the WWE model of fights every Saturday night or Monday night in the case of WWE, to build a set of programming that's really valuable to a broadcaster enough that they're going to give them a nice big upfront check versus having to build a constant marketing machine trying to market each pay-per-view fight when you've got so many to deliver. So I do agree with you on your take for sure.
So the last one we'll talk about, Nick, is FAST. So when we're talking about FAST, we're talking about free ad-supported streaming TV. And you made the point earlier when we were speaking about AVOD. The difference between FAST and AVOD is it's fast. It's still streaming like AVOD, but it is linear in the sense that it still has designated channels and designated timings. It's not something you can necessarily just watch when you want to watch it. There are designated times and designated channels to watch that. It's almost sort of like if like linear and like AVOD had a baby sort of thing. That might be an oversimplification, but sort of it's streaming, it's advertising, but it's also still linear in the way its channels are broken down, the way it actually distributes content. You're getting a lot of different people. Samsung TV. Oh, who did we interview recently? It wasn't Rakuten. Who did we interview? Oh gosh, I can remember his name. Drew Adams Drew. Oh
Oh,
man,
Roku.
just yes, Roku. Yes, I can't believe I forgot that. But those were sort of what we're talking about. And even some more specific examples. We look at DAZN and what they're doing with their coverage of women's football over in Europe as a way to try to monetize that. So, Nick, fast, overrated, underrated? I know you love advertisement models, but where do you feel on fast?
Yeah, I think it got a lot of steam in the industry as this new savior, new access point to the industry that everyone got really excited about, whether that be through the tech players and sports, as well as another channel, a medium to lock into. Ultimately, we're just talking about linear service being made available directly on the streaming product through a smart TV connection. Where it got a bit confusing or tricky is people started making their own sets of channels in their own platforms, like DAZN effectively have in theirs, as well as trying to make it available through various operating systems and serving it there. We could spend a lot more time. We probably should actually do a bit of a deeper dive into the fast world today, because it has evolved a lot in the last 12 months to 2 years. Maybe we could speak to Marion or someone else who's in that space a lot at the moment. But I think it's ultimately overrated across the industry as being this big new cash cow or audience driver. It hasn't really achieved either of those things, but it might get to a place in the future. That's only when linear stops being valuable and people going, what am I going to watch? Am I going to watch the traditional free-to-air linear product, or am I going to choose the fast set of channels? And if it's when it starts becoming that the set of channels on the fast offering, let's say the Samsung operating system or the Roku's linear offering, is good enough that it really competes with the linear offering as a whole, because there's still, you can be hundreds of channels on a fast series of channels, but they're typically not very good quality. So if they start raising the quality on there, it's going to be a chicken and egg thing a little bit. But I think then fast becomes a really valuable medium, because it will be the destination people are going to. At the moment, it's not nearly where it needs to be. There's a lack of regulation around fast, which is basically leaving the control in the hands of the operating system or the smart TV provider, depending on who's creating it. And that lack of regulation means they can basically do what they want with the content side and with regards to monetization. So it's a tricky world to navigate, but I think it will become more and more valuable progressively, but it's a slow burn. It's not going to happen overnight. It's only going to be once the linear channels and platforms start making a bigger investment into fast themselves. The BBC starts moving all of their content on various fast networks and making that available. Like I've used the one through Samsung where with CNN, and it killed me the amount of times the ad breaks they have, and their ad breaks they were serving through their fast channel was just like holding screens with some music. And I would rather watch crappy American ads than I would want to watch just a repetitive same song holding slide every single time through that. But I really wanted to watch it because it was when it was a war breaking out. So I wanted to get the best news supply I could on that information. So there's some work to be done to improve the quality and standards of fast. And as that comes, and as the bigger players start shifting to it, then I think you're going to see fast become a really important product.
My concern with fast is it reminds me a bit of streaming 5, 8 years ago, in the sense of, and I'll just use my parents as the example. My parents are finally at the point now, like they've got their Netflix subscription, they got their Disney Plus subscription, like they're sort of getting into that world. If I told my parents, go find a fast channel, they wouldn't even know where to begin. And I'll be honest with you, like I've got smart TVs. I've never at any point got into there. And one of the things, the arguments that was made for fast was discoverability, because we talked about for some of these tier 2, tier 3s, you're never getting a free to air deal because it's just there's only so much real estate. All of a sudden, fast creates real estate that didn't exist before. My concern is I just don't know if the consumption behaviors are at scale yet to really make it workable. I think that's really kind of more the issues. And I could be wrong because I'm just speaking anecdotally on my own experiences, but I don't know that many people that are currently using it as a product. And it almost reminds me of streaming 5-8 years ago, where you were still having to convince people that that was something to do. And I agree. I think if consumer habits change, yes, but I still feel I'm not sure everyone even knows how to access fast channels, which is kind of a problem.
Yeah, I think there's this. The TV I had in the UK was a smart TV. Sorry, it was a Samsung TV, and it took me ages even just to properly spend some time on the fast product because I didn't really know what I was getting myself into. And my conclusion was it's a mishmash of very average content, and that's pretty much it. But it's getting better, and it's going to continue to get better as, again, I talked about the ad dollars continue to move to make it more of a viable monetization product, and audiences start moving. Some of it's all chicken and egg, which makes it really tricky, but more regulation, more advertising dollars coming, and audiences shifting over. I think you'll start to see that getting some real steam sooner rather than later. So I think it's definitely one to continue to follow, but it's just those who have rushed into that space. I don't think there's been much benefit of being a first mover. I know that some of the operating systems can be very flippant in whether you've got a space. Let's say they've made a commitment. We're going to have about 200 channels available on our fast operating system. Well, we can pull out one and drop in another one on a whim because they have the controls, they have the keys. That's not the case in linear. It's so regulated. You can't just do those types of things. So I think it's definitely one to follow. And I think it's going to be developing really quickly. There's some really good people who operate in this space who can definitely give more insight into how that's evolving and shaping. But it's got a long way to go before it's really at the pointy end of providing value to the sports industry.
For sure. Well, everyone, I hope you enjoyed that episode. A little something different than what we've normally done. And if you've got differences of opinions and you think we're wrong on something, definitely let us know. But I hope you enjoyed the episode, and we'll catch you next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Now, before you go, if you liked what you heard today, be sure to rate and review and just let me know what you think on social. You can find me on most social platforms as SportsProNick. And please do spread the word of the podcast. There's no better way of marketing than word of mouth, whether that be in person or on social media. And if you don't like what you've heard, or you think we should be doing more or less of something, then reach out and let me know, as I'd love to hear from you. Thanks, Streamtimers. Until next time.